Chike was a young man with dreams bigger than himself, but he had one limitation, which was poverty. He came from a family where a day's meal was never certain and where hope sometimes felt unrealistic. Yet, he carried himself with a kind of ambition that made people believe he could one day change his story. He wanted more from life, more than the little his family had offered him, more than the endless circles of hustling that yielded little or nothing. And like many young men in our generation would do, he decided to think smart, and then the unthinkable happened. In the same town where Chike lived also another woman named Madame Susie, a woman whose name alone carried both admiration and fear. She was 60 years old, yet her presence commanded attention wherever she went. Her wrappers were always the richest fabrics. Her jewelries glistered even under the hot sun, and her cars were unlike anything the villagers had ever seen. She had the kind of wealth that could silence a room, the kind of power that made people bow when she passed. Some said she was generous. Others whispered that her riches came from things not to be spoken of loudly. When news spread that Madame Susie had set her eyes on Chike, the entire village erupted in gossip. Some people praised him that he will be the next millionaire in town. Others advised him against it, telling him not to marry his mother's age mate. But Chike didn't care about all their concerns. All he saw was a chance to step out of poverty. All he felt was the desperation that had followed him since his childhood, pushing him to grab any opportunity that looked like an escape. But in Madame Susie's proposal, he saw comfort, riches, and freedom from the struggles that had weighed on his family over the years. To him, it wasn't love, it was survival and escape from poverty. And for that reason, he said yes to Madame Susie's proposal. The day of their marriage was one the village would never forget. While other weddings in Amachala village were marked with borrowed canopies, shared bottles of palm wine, and drummers who played until their hands blistered, Chike's wedding to Madame Susie was like something out of a dream. She spared no cost. The compound was decorated with bright fabrics imported from abroad. The tables overflowed with food and drink, and musicians from the city filled the air with songs no one had ever heard before. Guests in the marriage ate until their bellies ached, and even those who laughed at Chike behind his back stretched their hands greedily for more food. For the first time in his life, Chike walked with his shoulders high. He was dressed in clothes finer than anything he had ever owned. His wrist was heavy with gold watch that Madame Susie had gifted him. People stared, some with envy, some with pity, but he ignored them all. As he stood beside his new wife, he told himself that this was the beginning of a better life. Poverty had finally loosened its grip on him, and for that alone, he felt no shame. Soon after the wedding, his life underwent a complete transformation. He moved into Madame Susie's mansion, a house so grand that it seemed to stretch forever. Every corner of it shined with wealth. Marble floors that reflected his image. Chandelier lights that sparkled even without electricity. And servants who bowed each time Chike entered the room. Chike, who once fetched water for himself to bathe from the stream, now had people ready to serve him at the snap of his fingers. At first, it felt like living in a dream. He had new clothes every week, food that never seemed to finish, and his pockets heavy always with money he never earned. He enjoyed the taste of luxury, the kind of life he had always envied in others. But in the midst of all this glory, Madame Susie gave him one warning, one rule that she made him promise never to break. She led him down a long corridor in the mansion and stopped before a door painted in deep red. Her voice was calm but firm as she said, "Chike, my love, whatever happens, never open this door. As long as you live under my roof, let this door remain shut." Chike, overwhelmed by his sudden fortune, nodded quickly. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wonder why such a rule existed. In his mind, it didn't matter to him. After all, he had everything he ever wanted. So why trouble himself with one locked door, he said. But the days that followed were not as simple as he thought. Strange things began to unsettle him. Madame Susie began to make demands for endless time of making love together. Sometimes a whole night, other times throughout the day. They went several rounds together, and Chike was already losing himself, but Madame Susie never gets satisfied. Chike wondered why an aged woman like that never gets satisfied at her age. Another strange thing Chike noticed was that in the dead of the night, Madame Susie often disappeared at odd hours. She would leave their bed without a word and return before morning, and her face always calm, her smile unchanged, as if nothing had happened. Within a few days, Chike began to notice changes within himself. He grew weaker, though he could not understand why. His limbs felt heavy. His body ached for no reason. And each morning he woke more tired than he had been the night before. He would look into the mirror and see a shadow of himself, as though his youth was being stolen quietly, drop by drop, while he slept. Still, he told himself not to complain. He reminded himself of the poverty he had left behind, of the hunger he had escaped. He convinced himself that his body was just adapting to the new environment and the lifestyle he had just been introduced to. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. He could feel it in the way that even Madame Susie looked at him sometimes. Her eyes always sharp and unblinking, though with love, but with a hidden motive he could not understand. And then, on the sixth night of their wedding, something strange happened that broke the camel's back. That night, as soon as Madame Susie disappeared from the bedroom, Chike started hearing strange chants echoing from within the mansion. He could no longer hold back his curiosity. When he listened attentively, he realized that the sounds were coming from the room Madame Susie had warned him never to go close to. Chike lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself to sleep. But the whispers and the chants became too consistent. He thought of breaking the rule, but he also remembered the consequences of losing the life of luxury he had just been introduced to a few days ago. But when his curiosity finally hit its peak was when he heard his name being mentioned in the middle of the chant. He stood up immediately and advanced towards the strange door with both fear and trembling. Yet his feet carried him forward even though he was afraid, and step after step he went towards the door until he stood before the entrance of it. His hand shook as he reached for the handle of the door. For a moment he hesitated, his breath shallow, his chest tightened. Then, with one push, he cracked the door open, and what Chike saw inside froze the blood in his veins. The room was nothing like the rest of the rooms in the mansion. It was a shrine decorated with red clothes. At the center of the room stood Madame Susie, making wild incantations. Chike's breath caught in his throat as he shouted, "So it is true. You are a witch that feeds on the strength of young men to stay ever young and wealthy. No wonder you never get satisfied in bed." As Chike tried to step back to run, Madame Susie was standing at the door as though she disappeared and appeared behind him. Her face was calm, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim candlelight. "You should not have opened this door," she said softly, her voice steady, almost gentle. But in her eyes, Chike saw something that stripped him of all courage. An ageless hunger, sharp and unrelenting, was fixed on him and unblinking, and as she moved closer, the marks of elegance that was usually in Madame Susie's face worn out immediately. It began to peel away, and her skin, once smooth and radiant, started to shift. Wrinkles spread across her face like cracks on dry land. Her hands, adorned with golden rings, twisted and turned into bony claws immediately, and her voice, though calm, now carried an echo that belonged to the other world. "You were warned, Chike. I told you never to open this door. Now that you know, you cannot leave. The same fate that met the other young men who broke the rule will soon be yours." With sudden strength, Madame Susie, in her changed form, stretched out her hand, and Chike felt his chest tightened. It was as though invisible ropes had wrapped around him, pulling the very breath from his lungs. His knees became weak immediately, and he fell to the ground, clutching at his throat, his eyes wide in terror. But somewhere inside him, a spark of defiance arose. He remembered the words of an old village priest who he had visited before the marriage. A man who had warned him that not every door of wealth leads to blessing. That priest had given Chike a small bead, telling him to keep it for the undecided days in his marriage. to Madame Susie. Though Chike laughed it off at the moment when the priest gave him that bead, but with trembling hands and trembling fingers, he reached into his pocket, desperate, and he pulled out the bead. The moment the bead touched the ground, the air in the room shifted. The candles flickered violently, and Madame Susie recoiled, hissing like an injured beast. Her face twisted further, her true form gradually unfolded. An ancient woman. Her body changed and became free, her eyes burning like fire and with anger. "You dare to challenge me in my house?" she snarled, her voice thundering towards Chike, but summoning every ounce of strength left in him. Chike crawled towards the door. Madame Susie's claws now swiped at him and gave him strange marks on his body. But the charm flared with a strange light, creating a barrier between him and Madame Susie. And with shaking hands, Chike managed to unlock the door and stumble into the corridor. He ran blindly through the mansion, his heart pounding. Madame Susie's voice echoing behind him, promising him that he would never escape from her grip. By the time Chike busted out into the night, his clothes were all torn and his body was weak. He was barely alive. He staggered down the road, guided only by the moonlight, until he collapsed at the doorstep of the very priest who had warned him earlier and given him the bead. The priest carried him inside, chanting prayers over him until the first light of dawn. When Chike finally opened his eyes, he was no longer in Madame Susie's house. He was safe, but the priest looked at him with grave eyes and said, "Your greed blinded you, my son. You walked into the lion's den for the promise of a life of luxury, and it almost cost you your life. Now you will carry these marks on your body as a reminder for your mistakes." My people, this story is about to take another turn. If you have not subscribed to our channel, please hit the like button and the subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell so that you will get notified when we post part 2 of this story. But I want to ask you a question. What do you think happened to Madame Susie later in part 2? And if you have an idea of what you think happened to Madame Susie in part 2 of this story, please tell me in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now. Look forward to see you in part 2.